Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending this webinar titled Political Crisis in Belarus as Seen from Brussels and Moscow. I'm very happy to have you all here and looking forward to an intense discussion. Let me also thank to the Vienna International Institute for Peace, especially also Lukas for his technical support, and our open think tank network partner Foraus from Switzerland for helping us to organize this webinar. I would also like to remind you that we are live streaming this event and it will be recorded. So if you consent, please stay with us. If you don't, I'm unfortunate. Furthermore, I would like to focus your attention that we are also having another webinar on the topic of Brexit on the 25th of February. With Professor Heidi Maurer from the University of Oxford and Ambassador Sven Mosler from the head of Brexit unit at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that will definitely be another interesting discussion. For today's program, each panelist will give an introductory statement of around 7 minutes. Magda will focus on the reactions to the events in Belarus from the Brussels perspective. And then MARYLIA will focus on the views from Moscow. Afterwards, BENNO ZOGG will provide his analysis of the situation and give some remarks on the speaker statements. And I would like to open the floor then to the questions from the audience. For the remaining time, to have an interactive discussion rather than a lecture, and therefore you can ask your questions either in the chat or you can raise your hand and I will then take your questions. Let me now introduce you our today's speakers and the discussant. MAGDA STUMVOLL works as a project coordinator and research fellow at the Austro-French Centre for Rapprochement in Europe, UFZ. Her research topics include the Eastern Partnership and internal EU policies. Since August 2019, Magda has been on the board of Ponto, first as president, now as vice president. She studied economics, political science, Romance, and European studies in Vienna, Regensburg, and Clermont-Ferrand. MARYLIA HUSHCHA is a Ponto board member and a research assistant at the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. She previously worked at Pontis Foundation in Slovakia, where she managed a capacity building project for NGOs in Russia. MARYLIA has completed training and fellowship programs at the UN office in Belarus, the European Academy of Diplomacy in Warsaw, the University of San Diego, and she holds a master's degree in European Studies from Comenius University in Bratislava. BENNO ZOGG is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. BENNO is also co-head of the Peace and Security Program at Foraus, a member of the steering committee of the OSCE network of think tanks and academic institutions, and a member of the expert council of the Minsk Dialogue Initiative. His areas of research include the international politics of Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, including the influence of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. Let me come now to today's topic. Belarus has seen protests since the presidential elections in August, which Lukashenko, who governs Belarus since 1994, claims he won, but the opposition says it was stolen. Just after the election, riot police detained almost 7,000 protesters and bystanders in just 4 days, holding them in inhuman and degrading conditions. Thousands of protesters have been rounded up and nearly all political opposition figures have been driven into exile or are jailed. However, demonstrations continued to march in Minsk and elsewhere, demanding the resignation of veteran President Lukashenko. While opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya remains in exile, legal charges against 2 other opposition figures could see them jailed for 12 years. The latest arrests coincided with Lukashenko staging a 2-day People's Assembly, which he says intended to promote constitutional reform, but which opposition has dismissed as a sham to help the veteran leader to clinch on power. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of protesters have been arrested and hundreds of journalists were detained. So far, politicians in Brussels and Moscow have closely observed events, but seemingly face diametrical positions on how to proceed on the issue. Our panelists will now present a recently published paper that investigates the EU's and Russia's attitudes and treatment of the political situation in Belarus. And I would like to give the floor now to MAGDA STUMVOLL.
Thank you very much, Julius, for the introductory remarks, and a good evening as well from my side. So, as already announced, I will present the EU point of view, more or less, on this topic, starting with the question, why does it matter for the EU what happens in Belarus, and why is it important that the EU acts? As Julius underlined, the peaceful protests by more than 200,000 Belarusians were countered by an extremely high amount of violence by the Belarusian regime. So human rights matter a lot for the EU. So when human rights are under threat, the EU should always act. The EU is based on a strong commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, so it cannot remain silent when human rights are heavily undermined in its neighboring country. And it's not only something that the EU is assuming to happen, but also the report of the OSCE Moscow mechanism stated that there was overwhelming evidence for massive and systematic human rights violation by the Belarusian security forces in response to these peaceful demonstrations. Second, stable neighborhood. When Commissioner Hahn was still in his position for Commissioner for Neighborhood Affairs, he once said that Europe's prosperity and security cannot be entirely separated from that of its neighbors. And he's completely right in that in order for the EU to be stable, and we saw how much the migration crisis destabilizes the EU, it is important that the EU's neighborhood is stable. And a third reason, which we can say that's a bit more a selfish reason, is that the EU claims, and especially the current von der Leyen Commission claims to be a geopolitical EU. It promotes stronger EU involvement on other continents in Africa and South America and Asia. But when remaining restrained on its own borders, when remaining silent to massive human rights violation on its own continent, it would not be a credible approach of the EU in order to become a real geopolitical actor. Concerning the EU rhetorics after the uprisings in Belarus, and the EU was and the uprising and the violence that followed afterwards. From the beginning on, the EU rhetoric was very harsh. It did not recognize Lukashenko any longer as the president, and the EU condemned the excessive use of violence, the criminal persecution, and the torture of the protesters. Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Josep Borrell personally called Putin not to interfere right after the first uprising, before even the EU took any action themselves. But it's important that this only happened after the election as well. EU heads of state and governments and foreign ministers received Tikhanovskaya as the official leader of the opposition. But it's important that this only happened after the election, so that accusations of interference cannot be justified. And the EU leaders, they promised her support for civil society organization. They joined her call for new elections, the release of prisoners, and end of violence. Concerning the EU sanctions, they were criticized that they were imposed too slowly and that they were in general considered to be too weak. Only a third round of sanctions in December 2020 added Lukashenko on the list. Before, the EU still hoped that it could act as a mediator, and it didn't want to send a too harsh message, therefore. But as well, one has to admit that there were as well that there are as well institutional problems in the EU. I'm speaking of the problem of unanimity and foreign policy decisions, which slowed down the European response sanction-wise. Now there are 88 official and 7 companies which face asset freeze and travel bans. But one has to compare it with earlier sanctions that were imposed in 2010-11, I think, yeah. When 250 individuals and 32 companies were faced sanctions. So there is still additional scope for further expansion of this sanction. But however, one has to admit that these sanctions do not have a real leverage to impact the course of the crisis, but they are in fact an important signal. But besides the sanctions, there are other important support for civil society in Belarus. Especially EU member states are granting visas for people facing persecution. They offer scholarship for students who were kicked out of the universities because they joined the protest, and they are redirecting money which was foreseen for the state directly to Belarusian civil society organization and media. And that does influence how the protesters see the EU. From how they see the EU to how the protests are seen by the EU. The EU in the beginning linked the uprising to a democratic change, to a democratization of the system, but the protests were not nourished by a political vision. People just wanted to express their discontent with the system. In January 2020, 52% of the Belarusians thought that the country was heading in the wrong direction. You can find the source of this data in the paper that we wrote. So 52% were thinking that the country was heading in the wrong direction. And for the poor COVID management, which started later on in 2020, February and March 2020, gave the rest. So people then went to the streets. They wanted to have their voice heard, and that they wanted to show their discontent with the system, but they did not intend to start a democratic revolution. Julius, do I still have a minute because I mentioned OSCE in the beginning? Can I just
Sure, go ahead.
As I mentioned, OSCE and OSCE Moscow mechanism in the beginning, OSCE was invited to observe the elections in Belarus, what it usually does when elections are taking place in the participating countries, but Belarus was not. But Belarus did not invite OSCE in time, so OSCE cannot observe against the will of a country. But after the election, and 17 OSCE participating states invoked the Moscow mechanism. This is a mechanism which can be launched to start investigation when serious human rights threats in an OSCE country arise. But here as well, Belarus did not collaborate with OSCE. It claimed there were no valid reasons for invoking this mechanism, so it did not allow the special rapporteur for this task inside the country. So he had to conduct his research from outside via digital means. Luckily, we can say we had all had our training in digital means this year, so it was possible for him to write a good overall report on the situation in Belarus and the violation was going on. And the report was an important, the report and the fact that the mechanism was invoked was an important sign. But however, Belarus did not further seem impressed by this neither.
Right, thank you, Magda. Marylia, can you please give us your remarks?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I would like to focus mainly on three questions. The first one, why did Russia support Lukashenko after the elections? Why did it recognize him as the president? Why is the perception of the what is the perception of the Belarusian crisis in Moscow? And the third one is, what are Russia's and Lukashenko's plans for the constitutional reform in Belarus that was announced? So Russia's support for Belarus came not really immediately after the elections. So Putin congratulated Lukashenko with the victory on the next day of the elections, but his message was very, formal. So there wasn't really a lot of praise as it usually happens. And the first days, Moscow remained rather silent, observing how the situation develops, how the protest develops. And in some days, it eventually decided that it will back Lukashenko. Throughout August, Lukashenko and Putin had several phone calls. And by the end of the month, Putin also promised a military reserve for Lukashenko in case he doesn't manage to calm down the protests on his own. So there are several reasons why Moscow actually decided to support Lukashenko, because initially it wasn't really, that clear. And I have to say that Lukashenko also managed to stay in power not only thanks to Moscow, but also due to his crackdown and repressions, and the fact that the security forces largely remain on his side, as well as the high-ranking civil servants that are loyal to him. So Lukashenko is a well-known person in Kremlin, and this is also another factor that added some sort of certainty for Russian elites, rather than going into dialogue or any sort of negotiations with the opposition that is not very known in Russia. None of the leaders has been somehow prominent before the elections on the international scene or also in the country in the political sense. So it was much easier for Russia to back Lukashenko because they know who he is, even if they don't really like him that much. So weak Lukashenko also has its own advantages for Russia because it's more susceptible to any sort of concessions that Moscow might want to have. And again, Russia's population also is witnessing an authoritarian system at home. So letting Lukashenko fall as a result of a mass protest might set a precedent for Russia itself. That's something that Moscow would also want to avoid. So Lukashenko and Putin met already in September. Lukashenko received a 1.5 billion credit already, and then now they're meeting in February at the end of this month, and apparently he'll receive another credit already of 3 billion. So that poses again certain questions: to what extent Russia will want to finance a fallen regime, but so far it looks like there is not many alternatives that it has. So what is, to my second point, the perception of the Russian elites of the Belarusian crisis? Generally, Russian elites view the crisis in Belarus as another color revolution. And this comes out of this strong belief that society cannot really self-organize on such a wide scale. So the idea is that there is always some sort of an organizer, some sort of an actor, an external actor who actually manages the whole situation. And so Russia's elites believe that the protest is organized by the West. And it's quite a genuine belief. It's not some sort of, not only propaganda. And this protest is led by the West, and especially by Poland and Baltic states. And such things as, for example, the fact that exiled Belarusian opposition leaders are now based in Vilnius or Warsaw serves in Russian eyes as another proof that actually the protest is led from these countries and by these countries. So as you see from the very start, for Russia, the conflict in Belarus is actually a geopolitical one. It's not about, political crisis and disagreements within the Belarusian society. It is about who of the external actors has more leverage and who actually, dominates within the country from the outside. And in the current situation, of course, Russia has more leverage, and Lukashenko as well. But there seems to be also certain disagreements between the Kremlin and Lukashenko and their plans for this constitutional reform that was announced. So, as I said, people in the Kremlin don't necessarily like Lukashenko. They supported him because he was the best option for a while, but there is an understanding also that some sort of transition will have to happen, and he's a convenient actor to manage a transition according to the interests that Russia has. And since there will be a transition, the best probably scenario would be to have another pro-Russian leader, but maybe even better would be to have not just one leader, but decentralized system that has more entry points than just the leadership of the country. And so these entry points can be also occupied, these positions in the government, seats in the parliament, companies, businesses, state enterprises. If those positions in these institutions are occupied also by pro-Russian actors. So there were already, during the fall, I think, there were some sort of attempts to create a pro-Russian party. So far, they were very poor and failed, more or less. But we will see what will happen. One of the problems with these pro-Russian parties is that there is no sort of anti-Russian group in Belarus. So there is no sense to be pro-Russian if there is not so many anti-Russian people in Belarus in general. But this might also change since Russia supports Lukashenko. People are becoming even more, set against him, and they protest already for a long time. So this dissatisfaction with Lukashenko might also grow into dissatisfaction with Russia. So for Lukashenko himself, the constitutional reform is just sort of, response to the protest demands. The protest, as he interpreted the protesters demanded some sort of a change in the country, and so he's given this change through this constitutional reform, which will probably, under his rule, result in some sort of cosmetic changes or some rearrangements within the country that will, in any case, keep his, leading position. So his basically aim is to remain in power, whether as a president or as some sort of Kazakh model leader of some Security Council, or maybe this Belarusian People's Congress that took place last week. This we don't know. We don't even have lots of details about this reform and what it will entail. But the idea is that he will stay there as long as he can. So maybe we can discuss more later on about the Congress, the People's Congress and everything. But as a conclusion, maybe I would like to give this outlook that our kind of main conclusion from this paper was that the initial positions of the EU and Russia are actually different. So Russia sees it as a geopolitical crisis. The EU sees the root of the crisis is within the country, but at the same time, if one of the actors sees it as a geopolitical one, it inevitably becomes one. So the EU actually will have to somehow react to it much more decisively if it is affected directly. And this might happen once the situation in Belarus, again escalates to a certain degree, which many people are expecting will happen in spring. So I guess the sort of big recommendation to the European Union is to develop a comprehensive Belarus policy, to actually work out several scenarios, how things will develop, what then can the EU do, how can we coordinate with the United States, with Canada, with the UK, and others who actually support the demonstrants and demonstrators and the opposition in Belarus. so that when a situation comes that the EU has to react, it's not just a reaction, but it's, you know, like a thought through policy. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MARYLIA. And I would like to ask BENNO for his remarks now.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for your presentations and the interesting paper. I think you already covered a lot of aspects. There's 3 points I would like to make, and raising questions more so than answers, on Russia, on the West, and playing devil's advocate, if you will, in a third point. Firstly, you don't make that point explicitly, but you hinted at it several times, and it seems to me that to any further developments, Russia appears key. In political science, one would talk about a veto player, an actor without whose support no agreement is possible. And there is speculation about Russia's motives. Events have a strong geopolitical component, as you indicated, but I wonder about the Kremlin's true perception of it. We do see the rhetoric of Lavrov and Peskov and so on. They do blame foreign powers. They do blame the opposition as being influenced by the West, as you indicated, MARYLIA. But deep down in their private meetings, does the Kremlin really see events in Belarus as Western interference only, or also as people being fed up with Lukashenko? After all, Russia itself feels frustration over Lukashenko at times. And exactly because I think this is so, what is the Kremlin doing to change it? They cannot tie their influence to Lukashenko forever, as you rightfully point out. The Kremlin needs to plan ahead. And losing influence in Belarus is not an option at all. So accordingly, we have not just seen a Russian preference for constitutional reform, we have seen actual pressure to that end. So the constitutional reform we will see may not just be cosmetics, as Lukashenko would prefer it, because Russia is a factor in it. So one wonders how the Kremlin will shape developments, what incentives, what disincentives they will offer, and through whom they will act. Already, the media and the media space, which is largely influenced by Russia, is an important tool. And as MARYLIA indicated, but also as leaked documents indicate, we should watch out for political parties and movements to that end. The second point I would try to make is on the West, or the EU in particular. The US is certainly important to be on board, but the EU is in more of a position to trying to shape policies. And maybe there's a small element that the Kremlin also reacts less allergic to the EU than the US getting involved. You mentioned earlier, Magda, the signaling effect of sanctions. Many Western countries have not recognized Lukashenko. They have received Svetlana Tikhanovskaya like a president of a country, if you will. But I wonder how long the West can uphold staying firm vis-à-vis the Belarusian regime. In your paper, in your recommendations there, you make an important point, which is currently probably not too popular in Brussels, in Warsaw, in Vilnius, that EU-Belarus relations should still entail an element of cooperation if there is genuine interest to do so. We're talking expert-level exchange in particular. And cooperation actually still exists. Just earlier this month, I think, there was an agreement on technical assistance between the EU and Belarus in the fields of education, customs affairs, and so on. And the existing frameworks, like the Eastern Partnership, need to be maintained. To go even further, in the end, the EU and Belarus's neighbors in particular are still interested to have an independent Belarus that is not just a Russian satellite, whose population is not impoverished, whose nuclear power plant is safe, and so on. In the end, the West cannot just interact with the Belarus it wants to see, but with the real Belarus as it is. This still fully means that sanctions need to remain in place. Support for civil society, for free media, for victims of the regime need to exist. And the EU needs to keep insisting on an end of repression, of course. My third point relates to those previous points, and I'll play devil's advocate for a second. I read between the lines of your paper in your scenarios and hypotheses about further developments. even though protests and civil society have triggered events, there currently appears to be little way for them to change the picture. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya or the Coordination Council do not exercise any real power. The All Belarusian People's Assembly meeting last week that you mentioned made an appearance of civil society incorporation, but a very poor one, of course. There were 2,700 handpicked people attending. There was no expectation whatsoever that actual political decisions will be made. In the end, not even this fake civil society presented a roadmap for constitutional change, for elections, for an amnesty for certain prisoners, and so on. It really strongly appears that decisions are made inside the presidential palace in Minsk and in the Kremlin. And, in a way, among the Belarusian elite and large parts of the population who are tired of the regime, but who are not willing to risk their lives or careers. So the devil's advocate concludes, what happens in the streets in Belarus, even though it is so impressive and bold, currently appears almost irrelevant. With this sober assessment, I guess let's wait for spring. We will certainly see a resumption of popular pressure and maybe new impetus for any of their demands to be heard. To conclude, in the end, we're all wondering where Belarus is heading. That's the questions I'm asked the most about scenarios and developments. And in the paper, in your presentations, you hint at elements of what a next political order can look like. And it appears to be, if I had to put a label on it, a managed transition. Managed by Lukashenko and the Kremlin alike, currently it seems. There's no clear roadmap for that yet. Lukashenko's promises change like the weather. It may take 2 years, as you say, but it may also take 5. In the meantime, we may see his face and his moustache around for another while, but some political transition, and with that you conclude your paper, and I will conclude as well, some political transition is inevitable.
Thank you very much, Benno, for your comments. That was very, very intriguing and very interesting analysis. From the panelist side, do you want to quickly reply to Benno's comments? MARYLIA, please go ahead.
Sure. I will take up several of them. Thanks a lot, Benno, for all your comments. Very interesting. The first one, very interesting one. Is it a real belief of Russia's elites that the West is managing the crisis in Belarus or not? And I think the answer is both. I think that it's some sort of psychological state where you suppress something you don't really want to have, and you repeat and repeat and repeat something that how you want to see it, and then it becomes the truth. And I think that's exactly what's happening, and it's happening not only in the Kremlin or in Russia through media. It's happening in Belarus to Lukashenko's loyalists. Many of them, if you hear all the leaked recordings of the police officers, of loyalists, civil servants speaking some between themselves, it's just crazy how they actually argue their positions. They literally say that those people, they don't have place in our society because they're somehow wrong and they're just not real Belarusians. So it's really, I don't think that they're bad people or something, but it's just the state in which, the reality in which they live. So I think initially they might have realized that the Belarusian public is indeed has had enough of Lukashenko, but as soon as they decided that that's the better option for them to back him, this realization was not relevant any longer. Constitutional reform, cosmetics or not, that's also very interesting, because I think that that's where the main disagreement between Lukashenko and the Kremlin is. And this we really know little about. These are just, some closed meetings of the high officials, and nothing so far has been revealed. There was one leaked document from a pro-governmental think tank in Belarus that made a couple of suggestions as to how to redistribute powers to the parliament from the president and so on, but it's nothing confirmed. So we might also find out the eventual, changes that will be offered at the referendum, maybe, I don't know, a month before a referendum or something like this, or not at all, or the referendum will be postponed, or Lukashenko will say that we need to, still check if the constitution in its new form will work, so I'll stay a little bit longer so the country doesn't fall apart. So it's all very, very hazy. About the civil society, I think I will make it my last comment. I would agree and disagree on the fact that that civil society and the opposition have little leverage or little influence on the political situation in Belarus, because the protests have the main influence on the political situation in Belarus. We cannot underestimate them. Indeed, the opposition has little leverage now because they're abroad or in jail, and this is something that really prevents them from supporting the population. If you're in Belarus and you're, you cannot, put a white flag on your balcony because you will be arrested. Then when someone from Vilnius tells you, that you're great, it doesn't help that much, But without the protests, the opposition is just toothless. They're really from abroad. They cannot do anything. And I'm being a little bit, harsh on them now, but what I mean is that they are also facing a dilemma. Either they're staying abroad and cannot really influence the situation in Belarus, or they come back to Belarus and go to jail. And this will probably most likely actually incite the protest again. So people will go on the streets in big numbers again, but at what cost? And this is the question, and this is something that I'm personally, for example, waiting for how the spring will go, because protesters are now, preparing, sort of. The weather will be better, people, will be prepared, they will go on the streets, but the security forces are also preparing, and they are preparing not only for the spring, they're already doing their job now. For example, today or yesterday, the Independent Journalists Association was, police came there. They arrested the leadership of the association. So they are cracking down very progressively on the institutions that are actually gathering people around themselves throughout the winter. So if they continue in this pace, who will be left there in the spring? So I agree absolutely that there is a great cost, and there is sort of the value added is less than we would like to have it, probably. But without it, the situation would completely, if not go back to normal, but stagnate, absolutely. Now there is still some sparks. Now there is still some reminders that things are different these days. So I would say that if there is someone who can actually change something to the better, it's only the people. It's only the people. And this is what Moscow wants us to believe, that the Kremlin is those who are deciding things in Belarus. It's not yet so. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you, Marylia, for your comment and your reply. I want to take one of the questions from Elke Schreik, and I want to give it to Magda. And Elke wants to know about the future of the anonymity rule in EU foreign policy, especially in certain policy issues in the external relations, and how long we will continue to see that, and whether there's change or whether there would be other means to address such events.
Thank you for that very important question. But I think there is there is much agreement on the fact that unanimity is just hindering the EU on just deliver on foreign policy decisions. But in fact, in order to get rid of unanimity, we need unanimity. So the way to change that will still be a long one. And I myself don't see a clear path how we will get there in the end. But I completely agree with you that in order for the EU to become a real geopolitical actor, and in order to be able to respond quickly to challenges in foreign policy area, we need to get rid of that. But Julius, if you allow me, I would as well answer to click on something that Julius, that BENNO said, with the entailing the cooperation between EU and Belarus and the collaboration on the expert level, which is in fact still a very important one, especially now that the EU Belarus, the collaboration and the Eastern Partnership framework was downgraded in November 2022, or was reduced to an expert level, where usually are exchanged as well on a high level, on a high ranking level. And it is still important that we have the exchange on the expert basis, but in order to have real progress, to have real exchange, we need the exchange on the expert level. And maybe this goes as well with the other question we have in the forum, Julius, if I may. There is a question if the EU can become a mediator in the crisis. And I think the EU can only become a mediator when both partners, which is like the civil society and the Belarusian regime in this one, they accept the EU to be a mediator. So as I mentioned in my opening remark, as Germany, France, and as well the High Representative of the Commission, they proposed that the EU became a mediator in this situation. But as it was not accepted, so the EU cannot force the others to accept them as a mediator. So this will be a question of acceptance, and I think the question is, or will they continue to support the opposition? I think EU always has the duty to support civil society in other countries, and as long as there are threats to civil society and an unpredictable amount of violence, the EU has to respond to that. Thank you.
Magda, thank you very much. And I also want to ask Benno if he wants to take on one of the questions that Gerhard Mango just posed. Possibly, Benno, do you know what is the highest level contact for the EU in Belarus, as Lukashenko is not recognized as Belarusian president?
I cannot answer on that particular one. I'd assume Foreign Minister Mackay is still an interlocutor of sorts. He, as opposed to other members of the cabinet that have been changed prior to the elections in Belarus, he's still a bit of a constant, so that may be a factor. If I may add to the previous question about potential mediator in this context, certainly one could argue that the EU and its member states, particularly neighboring countries, their stakes are too high, they're considered as too partial, so they will never be in a position to mediate. It may come down to powerful actors such as France and Germany to some extent. We see that in other contexts like Ukraine, in the South Caucasus and so on, who have a powerful role. But I think the precondition for any kind of mediation is that there's two parties at the table who meet each other at eye level, and we're so far from that. I mean, Lukashenko wouldn't talk to what he perceives as cockroaches. There's no way for anyone to come in and call it mediation or dialogue or anything along those lines. Hence, the offer of the OSCE in particular is still on the table. It's been endorsed by many parties in Europe. But even that, a consensus-based institution where Belarus and Russia and so on are members, even that offer has been rejected. So we're very far from anything resembling mediation or dialogue.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe we can have a look at the whole field of sanctions, because Magda already addressed it. Gerhard Mangold also wants to know more about it. We had the anonymity question already, so it seems to be very interesting to see what kind of effects those sanctions or this particular sanctions regime might have on Belarusian decision-making. Magda, do you think a fourth round of sanctions will come, and do you think those could be sectoral sanctions, really facing chunks or state enterprises which are so important for the Belarusian economy? And what do you think? What kind of outlook would that have on the prospects and policy goals?
There are some rumors that a fourth round of sanctions will be imposed soon, but there is still no valid information on that we can find. But in fact, sectoral sanctions are in fact would be an interesting means, because they for sure would diminish the income of the regime itself, but for sure they would be less they would less be triggered to specific persons or the individuals, so they will harm the Belarusian society more as a whole, and the Belarusian society is already suffering a lot. So the EU, I think, will be very careful on imposing sectoral sanctions, but it will. I think the discussion about them will for sure be on the table. But the fourth round of sanctions would for sure include an additional amount of people, so local authorities, CEOs of state enterprises and relatives. These people would face further assets ban and asset freeze and travel bans. And yeah, this is for sure. I'm quite sure that this will still come.
Thank you. And then we have a question for MARYLIA. MARYLIA, how do you assess the likelihood of splits within the Belarusian elite to occur should the protests continue in spring?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. There are some civil servants and also police officers and others who have already resigned and sort of went on the other side and now are supporting the protest. But the longer the whole situation lasts, I think the more scared and repressed those people in the elite also become, because the longer they stay there, the more they are also seen as perpetrators of those crimes. So it's not that they won't be accepted, but they will be just afraid that they are, they will be irrelevant and dismissed, and I don't know, if not killed, because these are the fears that the Lokashanka and all of those people are trying to promote among them, that those people, they will not have mercy on you. Although actually the opposition, especially in the first months, they were very actively encouraging those people to step on the other side and saying that there will be no sort of lustration or anything, that it will be all peaceful. They will not somehow be taken revenge on or something like this. Yes, of course, it is very important that the supporters of Lukashenko come on, switch their opinion. But the longer the crisis lasts, the harder it is to do. And there was another question also by Gerhard Mangold, the last one, on the protesters and the industrial workforce. So yes, the strikes are actually very important. And had they been more successful in summer, we would have not have this kind of discussions today, because that was really crucial in the first days, that everyone goes on strike, and if the whole country stops, what can you do? But this didn't happen. Happen also due to intimidation, due to all this pressure on the workers. Now there is still sort of, it's called like Italian strike, meaning that it's without any last day. It's continuous, going on and on all the time. And some workers one by one still join it, but very few. So I guess there should be some kind of boost to make them do it again. But of course, the broader like layers of the society, the more layers of the society join the protest, the easier it is to win.
Thank you, Marylia. I have one more question, a personal question that I'm very interested in, that I would like to ask BENNO. Marylia has mentioned the credit line that Russia has been giving to Belarus previously, and the 1.5 billion credit and possibly another one. And we all know about the economic dependence and the interlinkage between Belarus and Russia. Could you maybe dwell a little bit on this connection and the viability of Russian aid for the economic survival of Belarus?
Mm. Certainly. I mean, Russia's economic role in Belarus has always been very strong, particularly in the form of energy subsidy, which helped Belarus export petrochemical products as well as electricity and so on. So it's been important. But in the last few years, we've actually seen dispute between Belarus and Russia about the amount of these subsidies, particularly and specifically about oil and gas prices. Now they've reached an agreement on it, which is obviously closer to Russia's terms than to Lukashenko's terms this time around. End of last year, when we saw this credit line of 1.5 billion being promised, I think at a meeting in Sochi to Belarus, this has been interpreted as a signal that Russia is still backing the Lukashenko regime. What it means technically in terms of accounting is that these 1.5 billion will be used to repay particularly Russian loans that were issued previously. So one can assume that these rubles or dollars or whatever the amount is will actually never properly leave Russia. But the symbolism of it has been very important. And now that there's talk about another 3 or 3.5 billion loan, again, symbolism is key to that, less so than accounting. It will still help to keep Belarus afloat for the time being because it has to repay big amount of debts that it holds, particularly with Russia, but also with China. There's euro bonds involved as well that Belarus has to repay. And actually, many observers and economists in particular are worried about the sovereign debt crisis in the case of Belarus. If there's now a political crisis on top of an economic crisis by the pandemic as well as by the upheaval in Belarus, there's legal uncertainty about Belarus. Foreign investors will be hesitant to come in. Hence, we may actually see an economic crisis and a debt crisis, even a currency crisis coming in. Hence, Russian support will be crucial to somewhat alleviate that. And this economic lever is one very powerful one with which Russia can obviously signal its support, but also help alleviate the Belarusian regime's immediate worries, as in how do they pay their salaries the next month.
Thank you, Benno. Then I have another personal question for Magda. And I was curious because I was reading about this German program to finance the documentation of human rights abuses in Belarus. And I was wondering if you know any other means how the EU or its member states can actually support the coordination council or the Belarusian civil society, especially economically. What kind of programs would there be available, and how long would that take to roll out, actually?
In fact, in autumn, the EU was already very quick. In August, they already redistributed money that was foreseen for Belarus, for the regime, to civil society to directly help them to organize or to support the work of the independent media. And in December again, they redistributed, I have this number here, 24 million euro to the civil society that was initially foreseen for the regime. And other help or other support from the EU member states are the scholarships, visa facilitation that I already mentioned. But in fact, that is something that not EU itself provides, but rather EU member states and as well the NGOs in the member states. And here I have to underline the support of Poland and Lithuania, who have a special interest in Belarus, the Belarusian civil society, who look back at the common history and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And for sure, these countries are much more involved in everything that is going on in Belarus than compared to faraway Portugal. But in general, in the EU, there is agreement that we should continue to support the Belarusian civil society.
Thank you. Benno, are you taking the question on the Duma elections?
I may comment on that. The question is whether Belarus may become an issue during the Duma election campaign in Russia. I would broaden the question, not necessarily related to the Duma elections, but to the Russian political discourse as such. And I would argue that Russia at the moment certainly has bigger fish to fry than the Belarusian protest situation. We're talking about ongoing protests in the Far East related to the Navalny case and so on. But this certainly has an effect on Belarus, more so than Belarus on Russia, because it makes the Kremlin even less keen on any kind of experiments, on any kind of popular protest succeeding. And who promises that best in Belarus? This is Lukashenko. Hence, it reinforces his position because he's, as MARYLIA put it, a more reliable actor there. He can promise stability more so than others. He promises that no experiments will happen, so the situation will be roughly stable, particularly because Russia has bigger issues. And any kind of protests that they also have to actively take care of in Belarus, for example, would not be seen favorably. Hence, there is a relation between the two for sure.
MARYLIA, I think here's another question for you on the Armenian model in regard to Belarus and the colored revolutions. Do you want to take this one? It's in the chat.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but the question is whether the Armenian model can apply to Belarus. Whether we can, yeah. Well, I guess there was some talk on that also at the very beginning of the protest. So 9th of August, 10th of August, we kind of people thought that there could be this, more like peaceful transition this way, but no, not any longer. It's just yeah. So Lukashenko, he didn't step down. He just remained there. He cracked down on the society, and the trauma that it also caused cannot, be forgotten or anything. Even if he had stepped down and then some sort of transition under democratic opposition or under Tikhanovskaya was happening. Still, the whole political system, would, fall apart, and then there would be some sort of also many sorts of troubles and chaos and everything. So my guess would be that in that situation in August, he would have been then later in history seen maybe even in a very positive light, because he, during his 26-year-old rule, yes, there was no political freedoms, but it wasn't, much. It was some sort of stability, even if not a long-term one. But after these months of repressions and torture and everything that happened, there is no way we can turn back. So So there is no way that he can already leave and just be left, like peacefully. The only way he can just leave the country, that's his sort of only choice, and he kind of doesn't have where to go if he's not the president. That's the problem. That's why he clings to power. So it's not anymore even comparable, unfortunately.
Great, thanks. Then we have another question for Benno by Waltraud Urban. One route of the new Silk Road passes Belarus, and there's a new industrial zone to be established there. Is there any reaction of China on the situation in Belarus?
I think it's fairly common these days to, at some point, raise the China factor in a lot of debates, and on Belarus as well. This industrial zone that is mentioned is the Great Stone Industrial Park. It's a special economic zone just outside of Minsk airport. Anyone has ever passed from the airport into Minsk city has passed it, and at the airport has seen all the Chinese signs and speakers there as well. So China relations are certainly favorable for Belarus, and they've been emphasized, and a lot of hope has been attributed to the Belt and Road, in particular to the Great Stone Industrial Park as well. But as usual, when it comes to China, there has been a reaction to the situation in Belarus, but it's been the usual and the predictable one, which was that there was a letter of congratulation to Lokashenko for being elected. That's a formality. Apart from that, China is quite hesitant to be engaged, I guess for a number of reasons. First of all, it's far off at first. Even though the Silk Road passes through Belarus, it is somewhat of a logistical hub for trains, for example, that are Europe-bound from China. There's certainly an element of that, but China would not get politically involved at all. So it hasn't extended a credit line either, apart from the usual or previous loans that it has extended to Belarus. So Belarus also owes a few $1 billion to China, among other creditors. So I guess I wouldn't overemphasize the China factor. And one last point on that. Hopes in Belarus have been very high for China to come in and offer an alternative to the West and to Russia when it comes to modernization and economic growth. But these hopes have only to a very low extent been fulfilled. So there's some companies that have started investment in Belarus. There's more Chinese tourists coming in and so on. But it is not the actor that can alter the political picture, nor allow Belarus economic growth in any way. So I wouldn't overemphasize this factor too much.
Great. Thank you so much for taking on this question. And I think there was, if you have any more questions, please write it either in the chat or in the Q&A section. If there are no questions, meanwhile, let me ask one more question to Marylia.
Sorry, Julius, there is a question from Sebastian Sommers.
Oh yeah, there's one more. Sorry, I skipped that. That was not intentional.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's a question about if the EU acknowledges Russia as an actor on the same level than the US, but in the Belarusian question. And I think EU is very realistic about it. It's due to its Eurasian Economic Union and the Union state that Belarus and Russia are in together. Ties between these two countries are for sure, and as well due to the shared history, ties are quite way stronger than between EU and Belarus. As well, I think for trade terms, nearly 50% of Belarusian trade is made with Russia and 18% with the EU. So this already shows us something. So Russia is Russia is the most important partner, more or less, if we could say that. But we also saw that the EU is aware of that in its early reaction to the protests. The first thing that the EU did was calling Putin. It was Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Joseph Borrell who called Putin and asked him to not to interfere in the protest, knowing that it is their they consider this their political backyard, so if one can say it like this. And the EU, if when we mentioned already Armenia, we can as well go back to Ukraine. So I think the EU learned its lesson from Ukraine. So it really knows that that it has to acknowledge Russia as an actor there, and it has that the two of them have to speak together, have to work together. Yeah.
Thanks, Magda. And I will take the final question, and maybe Benno again wants to address it. Benno, can you elaborate on best case and the worst case scenario in the case of Belarusian developments?
Since we're approaching the end, I'll be very brief. Obviously, best and worst case always depends on one's perspective. But let's say we can maybe roughly agree on a view from Vienna, if you will. Worst case scenario certainly is a Russian invasion, which is very unlikely, though. It could be an entrenched dictatorship and police state under Lukashenko or someone very similar. This is unfortunately the trajectory roughly that we see now, even though I don't think it will lead into a fully unfree state. I assume some personal freedoms will be restored. A best case scenario would probably not be a revolution, because too much upheaval will create instability. It would be some kind of dialogue that's initiated, some kind of coalition government that would be installed, and such a Belarus, still a sovereign state, incorporating members of the old elite and of the protest movement, would have favorable ties to both Russia and to the West without any desire to join the EU, for example, anytime soon. That's in a way a realistic best scenario, even though it's not very likely at this stage. But maybe my colleagues have other opinions.
Any comments on MARYLIA? Maybe some short comments on the outlook.
I largely agree with Benno. I just wanted to add that the opposition until today, how they perceive themselves, they also advocate for dialogue. They don't say that we want to dismiss Lukashenko and just be there instead of him, but they're talking about dialogue until today, which is unfortunately, we hear only from this one side, and the other side rejected dialogue long ago. So far as the things are these days, they don't really need it that much. So they don't feel that they need to go into talks.
Great. So as far as I can see, we've done a very good job in answering all the questions, or at least most of them. And let me take the occasion and say again, thank you so much again to all the panelists and to the discussant, Benno, for your time. It was a really, really interesting discussion. And I would also stress again that I'm very grateful to have this paper by MARYLIA and MAGDA that was actually written in cooperation by Ponto, the ÖFZ, and the EEP. So I'm very happy that we have had the occasion to present this paper and discuss it in all length. If you want to read it, you can find it on the ÖFZ, the EEP, or the Ponto webpage. And for the outlook, as I was saying, we will organize another webinar on the Brexit issue that will be extremely interesting as well on the 25th of February. So I would love to see you again. Thank you very much for your attention and your interest in Belarus and the EU and Moscow's perspectives on the political crisis. And let me thank you again to all the panelists and the discussant, Benno from Switzerland, for his remarks. It was a really, really interesting discussion. I hope you have a great afternoon, and I'm looking forward to the next webinar. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye, everyone.